The morning I finally understood what was happening to me, I was sitting alone in my car in the parking lot of Walgreens, shaking so hard I couldn't get the key into the ignition. I'd just spent 20 minutes inside trying to remember what I'd come for. A pharmacist named Tyler, he couldn't have been older than 25, had walked me to a bench near the blood pressure machines and brought me a paper cup of water like I was someone who needed to be handled, carefully, like I was someone who might fall apart. I was 67 years old. I had taught high school English for 31 years. I had raised a son on my own after his father left when the boy was 4. I had paid off my house, maintained my garden, driven myself to every appointment, and remembered every student's name for 3 decades. And I was sitting in a Walgreens parking lot at 2 in the afternoon, unable to recall why I'd driven there. That was the moment I stopped blaming myself. That was the moment I started paying attention. It had been building for almost 8 months by then. Little things at first. I'd open the refrigerator and stand there, unable to remember what I wanted. I'd find my reading glasses in the freezer, next to the peas. I'd lose whole stretches of afternoon, not dramatically, not like a movie blackout, just a slow fuzziness, like static creeping in at the edges of a television picture. I'd look up and 2 hours had passed and I had nothing to show for them except a vague, heavy tiredness that had become my constant companion. My doctor ran blood work twice. She told me my B12 was a little low, that I should sleep more, that some cognitive slowing was normal at my age. I nodded and took the supplements she recommended and told myself she was probably right. I told myself I was probably fine. I want to be honest with you about something. I want to be honest because I think it matters. I didn't want to see what was right in front of me, not because I'm stupid, because the person in front of me was my son's wife. Because accepting what was happening meant accepting that someone I had welcomed into my home, someone I had tried to love, had decided that I was an obstacle. My son, Daniel, is 41 years old. He came back to live with me 3 years ago after his first marriage ended. He was broken in the way that quiet men get broken, not loudly, not dramatically, just hollowed out and going through motions. I offered him the guest room while he got back on his feet. He was back in my house for 8 months before he met Brianna. Brianna was 34. She worked in real estate. She had the kind of energy that fills a room before she walks into it, opinions ready, smile practiced, a talent for making you feel slightly off balance in your own home without ever saying anything you could point to. She and Daniel were engaged within a year. They married in my backyard. I paid for most of the wedding because Daniel asked me to, and because I wanted to believe I was being a good mother, not a foolish one. They moved in with me after the wedding. The house is mine, 3 bedrooms, paid off, in a neighborhood in Raleigh that has gotten considerably more valuable in the last decade. I told myself it was practical. I told myself I liked the company. I told myself a lot of things in those early months. Brianna cooked most evenings. I will give her that. She was in the kitchen every night, moving around it like it was already hers, and she made good food. She had opinions about how things should be stored, how the pantry should be organized, which cutting board was for what. Small assertions of ownership, one after another, so gradual I barely registered them individually. She started bringing me tea every morning about 4 months after they moved in. Herbal tea, she said. Good for inflammation. I didn't ask too many questions. I drank it because it was kind of her to make it, or I thought it was kind. I drank it every morning for months. The fog started about 6 weeks after the tea began. I didn't connect those 2 facts for a very long time. I want you to understand how easy it is not to connect those 2 facts when one of them is a cup of tea made by your daughter-in-law who smiles at you over the rim and says, "How are you feeling today, Carol? You look tired." My neighbor Patricia has known me for 22 years. We walk every Tuesday and Thursday morning when the weather allows, and we've had an agreement since her husband passed that we check in on each other, really check in, not just the wave from the driveway kind. Patricia started saying things to me in October that I didn't want to hear. She said I seemed distant. She said I'd repeated the same story about my garden 3 times in one walk. She said, carefully, the way people say things they've rehearsed, that she'd noticed I seemed confused sometimes in a way that didn't feel like me. I told her I was just tired. I told her getting older was humbling. She looked at me for a moment and then said, "Carol, has anything changed at home?" I said no. But something shifted. Something that had been sitting in the back of my mind, unexamined, turned over. I started watching Brianna more closely. Not suspiciously, I told myself, just more closely. I am an English teacher. I spent 31 years teaching teenagers to notice things, to read between lines, to understand that what people do is often more revealing than what they say. I turned that attention on my own kitchen. What I noticed was small. Brianna sometimes went to the hall closet before she brought me my morning tea. Not always. Most mornings she came straight from the kitchen. But sometimes, maybe twice a week, maybe more, she took a small detour. The closet where I kept extra pantry supplies. Old spices, backup paper towels, things I didn't need regularly. There was no reason to go in there on the way to bring me tea. I couldn't think of a single reason. I didn't say anything. I kept watching. I also started watching what happened to me on the days I drank the tea versus the days I didn't. I began declining the tea occasionally, saying I'd already had coffee, saying my stomach was off. On those days, I noticed, my head was clearer. Not perfectly clear, I was still tired, still not myself, but clearer. The static receded a little. The lost hours were shorter. I understood then. I didn't want to understand, but I did. I called Patricia from my car 2 days later, parked down the street so no one in the house could see me. I told her what I suspected. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "What do you need from me?" That is 22 years of friendship, right there. Not, "Are you sure?" Not, "That seems extreme." Just, "What do you need?" What I needed was a camera. Patricia's son-in-law worked in home security. She made a phone call. He came by on a Thursday when Daniel and Brianna were both at work and installed a small device above the kitchen cabinets, angled toward the counter where the electric kettle sat. It looked like nothing. A small, dark square that could have been a smoke detector component, if anyone looked at all. I also needed a new doctor. I asked Patricia to take me to a physician in Cary 30 minutes away, no one who would know me or my family, someone who had no existing context for Carol Whitfield being a little forgetful, a little tired, advancing age. Nothing to worry about. I made the appointment under my maiden name. Getting there without Brianna knowing required what felt, at the time, like an embarrassing amount of strategy for a 67-year-old woman in her own life. I told the house I was going to Patricia's for the morning. Patricia drove. I felt, sitting in her passenger seat, like a person who had been slowly convinced that she needed permission to exist and was only now starting to remember that she didn't. The doctor in Cary was a woman named Dr. Ellison. She was thorough and careful, and she asked me questions in an order that suggested she'd heard stories like mine before. She ordered a full panel, including a urine toxicology screening. She also asked me, gently, whether I felt safe at home. I said I wasn't sure. She wrote something down. I went back for results 12 days later. Patricia came with me. "I am going to tell you what Dr. Ellison told me, and I want you to understand that I heard it sitting in a very ordinary examination room, with a paper runner on the table and a poster about hand-washing on the wall, and that ordinary surroundings do absolutely nothing to soften extraordinary things." She said my blood work showed elevated traces of a benzodiazepine compound, a sedative that had not been prescribed to me. She said the levels were consistent with regular low-dose exposure over an extended period. She said this was not something that happened accidentally. She said, looking at me steadily, that she was obligated to ask me directly whether I wanted to involve law enforcement, and that whatever I decided, she would support. I sat with that for a moment. I looked at the hand-washing poster. I thought about my son. I need to tell you about my son, because he matters in this story, and I don't want to reduce him to a bystander. Daniel is not a bad person. I have to hold on to that even now, even knowing what I know about how long this went on while he was in the house. Daniel is a person who has spent his whole adult life being managed by people with stronger wills than his. His father, his first wife, and then Brianna, who had identified that quality in him, I think, from the beginning. I don't know how much he knew. I have thought about this every day since. I don't have a clean answer. What I do know is that Brianna had told him, in the months leading up to all of this, that she was worried about me. She had told him I was showing signs of serious cognitive decline, that she'd found me confused multiple times, that she thought it was time to think about my long-term care, to think about what would happen with the house, to think about whether I could really manage on my own anymore. She had been constructing a version of me, diminished, unreliable, fading, that served a very specific purpose. She wanted the house. That is the plain and unadorned truth of it. This house, in this neighborhood, is worth somewhere close to $600,000 now. She wanted to be in a position where she and Daniel could make decisions on my behalf. She was building the evidence for that position one foggy morning at a time. I went home from Dr. Ellison's office and I did not pour out the tea Brianna had left ready on the counter for me. I left it sitting there, and I watched the camera footage that night on my laptop, headphones in, bedroom door locked. I watched Brianna open the hall closet. I watched her take a small amber prescription bottle from behind the backup dish soap on the bottom shelf. I watched her shake something from it into my cup before she added the hot water and the tea bag. I watched her put the bottle back, close the closet, pick up the mug, and carry it to me with a smile that I had, for months, interpreted as caring. I watched it 4 times. Then I called Patricia. Then I called a lawyer. I want to explain why I called a lawyer before I called the police, because I've thought about whether that was the right order, and I believe it was. I was a woman who had been chemically sedated for months, whose son's wife had been systematically telling my son that I was losing my mind. I needed someone in my corner who understood how these situations get framed before I walked into any room where framing would matter. The lawyer, a woman named Sandra who had been recommended to me by someone in my church, told me I had done everything right. She said the camera footage combined with the medical evidence was strong. She said to preserve everything, touch nothing, and let her coordinate the next steps with the appropriate contacts. I did what Sandra told me. 3 days later, while Daniel was at work and while Brianna was, according to the household routine, running Saturday morning errands, 2 officers came to speak with her. I was not there for that. Sandra had advised me not to be. I was at Patricia's, sitting in her kitchen with a cup of coffee that I had poured myself, watching the light change on her backyard. Patricia put her hand over mine at some point and didn't say anything, and I was grateful for that, for the particular kindness of someone who understands that not every moment needs to be filled with words. Daniel came home to a house where his wife had been taken in for questioning, and his mother had spent 3 months being drugged without his knowledge or, at minimum, without him stopping it. I will tell you what he said to me when he called, because I think it matters. He said, "Mom, did you know about this? How long did you know?" And his voice was, I don't have a better word for it, cracked, like something had broken inside it. I told him all of it. I told him about the closet and the bottle and Dr. Ellison and the camera and the sedative in my blood work. I told him about the months of fog and the lost afternoons and the parking lot at Walgreens where a 25-year-old pharmacist brought me water like I needed handling. I told him everything in order, calmly, the way I had learned to tell difficult things to difficult students over 31 years of teaching not to wound, but because clarity is a form of respect. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I should have seen it. I told him that the people who do these things are specifically skilled at making sure you don't. I meant it. I wasn't saying it to make him feel better, though I hoped it did. I meant it because it's true. And because I have spent a significant amount of time since all of this happened, reading about elder financial abuse and elder medical abuse, and the patterns that show up again and again, the careful construction of a narrative about decline, the isolation from outside perspective, the targeting of someone whose word can be made to seem unreliable. Brianna had done this before. That came out later, a former employer, a previous relationship, a pattern that existed before she ever met my son. The formal charges took several weeks to solidify. In that time, I did a number of things. I changed the locks, which was my right and which I should have done sooner. I met with Sandra again and reviewed my will and the deed to my house, both of which were still entirely in my name and which I updated to reflect my current intentions clearly. I returned to Dr. Ellison for follow-up blood work, which showed the compound clearing from my system, and I began, slowly, to feel like myself again, not all at once, not dramatically, but in increments, like a window being cleaned from the outside, the world coming into focus by degrees. I also told Daniel that he was welcome to stay in the guest room while he figured out what his life looked like now. Not because I owed him that. I want to be clear that I was under no obligation, but because he is my son, and because I believe people can reckon honestly with what they failed to see and come out changed on the other side of lust. That is not a guarantee. That is a hope. There is a difference, and I am old enough to know the difference. Brianna was charged with criminal poisoning and elder abuse. Her attorney tried, in the early stages, to frame the benzodiazepine exposure as accidental, a confusion about medication, a misunderstanding. The camera footage made that argument very short-lived. When her attorney played the footage with her in the room, and her own face appeared on the screen, removing the bottle from the closet, measuring it carefully, returning it, she stopped looking at the screen. She looked at the table. She said, when offered the opportunity to speak, something that I will not repeat in full because I don't think it deserves to be repeated in full. The short version is that she believed I would eventually need full-time care anyway, that the house would have come to Daniel in time, that she was simply managing a timeline. Those are her words. Managing a timeline. As though I were a project. As though 67 years of living in this body, in this house, in this life, could be managed into someone else's schedule. I want to tell you what I felt when I heard that. I did not feel the rage that people might expect. I felt something quieter and more permanent. I felt the full weight of what she had decided I was worth, and I felt, and I mean this, grateful that I had listened to Patricia. Grateful that I had trusted the part of myself that said something is wrong, keep paying attention. Grateful that I had not talked myself out of seeing what I was seeing. She pled guilty to reduced charges as part of an agreement. She will not be in my neighborhood for a very long time. I will leave it at that. I still walk with Patricia on Tuesdays and Thursdays when the weather allows. My garden came back beautifully this spring. It had a hard winter and I wasn't tending it the way I should have been, but things that have good roots tend to come back. I have been sleeping better. I drive myself everywhere. I remember why I walked into rooms. Daniel is still in the guest room. He is in therapy, which I am glad about. We have dinner together on Sunday nights, and we are careful with each other in the way of people who have been through something that changed the shape of things between them, and who are trying to figure out what the new shape is. It is not easy. I did not expect it to be easy. I expect it to take time, and I have decided that I am willing to give it time. Here is what I want to say to anyone who is watching this, who is in their 60s or 70s or older, living with family, feeling like your mind is slipping in ways that don't quite make sense to you. I want to say, trust that. Trust the part of you that says this doesn't feel like me. Your history with yourself is long. You know the texture of your own mind. If something has changed and you can't account for it with sleep or stress or ordinary aging, you are allowed to investigate. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to see a doctor you choose yourself without telling anyone first. You are allowed to call a friend and say something out loud that you have only been thinking. You are allowed to put a camera in your own kitchen. I spent months apologizing for what I was losing. I was slower. I was confused. I was a burden and a worry. I internalized every version of myself that Brianna had been quietly distributing to my son for a year. I became, in my own mind, someone who needed to be managed. I was not that person. I am not that person. What I am is someone who paid attention when it mattered. Someone who made a phone call from a car parked down the street. Someone who sat in a doctor's office in Cary with a friend's hand over mine and listened clearly to what I was being told and decided what I was going to do about it. I am 67 years old. I manage my own life, and I plan to be doing exactly that for a very long time. If anything in this story sounds familiar, if you recognize something in the fog, in the confusion, in the slow feeling of being managed out of your own existence, please talk to someone outside your immediate household. A friend, a neighbor, a doctor, a senior services advocate. There are people specifically trained for this. I did not know that a year ago. I know it now. There is no embarrassment in asking. There is only the importance of asking. My roots are still good. I am still here.